Isabella Romano had forgotten what silence sounded like until the day Marco left the apartment in Boston's North End, once filled with the warm chaos of a marriage she'd believed was solid, now echoed with only her infant son's soft breathing and the hum of the refrigerator where she'd once aged her first experimental cheeses. She stood at the window overlooking Hanover Street, Lorenzo sleeping against her shoulder, and watched the couples below navigate the cobblestones with the ease of people who still believed in permanence. The letter from Marco's lawyers sat on the kitchen counter, crisp and final, explaining in cold legal language that he'd found someone else, someone without stretch marks, without the exhaustion of new motherhood, without the smell of cultures and rennet that had seeped into Isabella's skin from years of cheesemaking. She'd built her reputation one wheel at a time, learning her grandfather's Tuscan methods in a cramped commercial kitchen. But reputation didn't pay rent when your husband emptied the joint account on his way out the door. The farmer's market on Saturday morning felt different. Now a gauntlet rather than a celebration. Isabella set up her small table with hands that trembled slightly, arranging the few remaining rounds of her pecorino and aged provolone with the same care her grandfather had taught her. Even as panic whispered that this might be the last time, Lorenzo dozed in the carrier against her chest, a warm weight that steadied her even as it terrified her, this tiny person depending entirely on a woman whose husband had deemed her insufficient. The other vendors offered sympathetic glances. Everyone in Boston's artisan food community knew everyone else's business, and Isabella's humiliation had spread as quickly as the news of her husband's departure. She smiled and described her cheeses with practiced enthusiasm, emphasizing the traditional methods, the patience required for proper aging, the way good cheese couldn't be rushed. Even as she calculated and recalculated how many wheels she'd need to sell to cover next month's rent, by noon, she'd sold half her inventory, respectable but not enough, when a tall man with weathered hands and kind eyes stopped at her table, studying her cheeses with an intensity that made her pause mid-pitch. "You make these yourself?" Caleb Anderson's voice carried the unhurried cadence of someone unaccustomed to the city's relentless pace. Isabella nodded, watching him examine a wheel of her aged pecorino with the careful attention of someone who understood craft, who recognized the months of work compressed into each dense round. He told her about Maple Ridge Farm, about the dairy operation his grandfather had built in Vermont's Green Mountains, about the raw milk that was too good to simply sell by the gallon to distributors who paid barely enough to cover costs. His words painted a picture of rolling pastures and a century-old barn, of Jersey cows with names instead of numbers, of a place where the air smelled like grass and possibility instead of exhaust and disappointment. "I need someone who knows how to turn milk into something special," he said, meeting her eyes with directness that felt both disarming and oddly comforting. Isabella's heart lurched, not with the romantic foolishness that had led her to Marco, but with the sudden, dizzying recognition of a door opening when she'd thought all doors had slammed shut. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The proposal came so simply it almost seemed casual, but Isabella felt the weight of it settle in her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. "I can't pay much at first," Caleb admitted, his honesty refreshing after Marco's elaborate deceptions. "But there's a cottage, small but winterized, and all the milk you could use. If you can create something that commands premium prices, we split the profits 60-40 in your favor until the business is established. Then 50-50 partners." He pulled out his phone, showed her photos of a white farmhouse with black shutters, a red barn that had seen better days but still stood proud, pastures that rolled like green ocean waves toward distant mountains. The images blurred slightly as tears threatened, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming possibility that she might not have to surrender, might not have to crawl back to her parents in New Jersey with her tail between her legs, might not have to give up the craft that was as essential to her as breathing. Lorenzo stirred against her chest, making the small mewling sounds that preceded waking, and Isabella made a decision that was both terrifying and inevitable. "When can we start?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The practical obstacles assembled themselves in her mind with brutal efficiency over the following week. She had a month-to-month lease she could escape, but also debts, credit cards, maxed out, covering expenses after Marco left, a small business loan for equipment that still demanded monthly payments, the constant drain of childcare costs that evaporated savings with alarming speed, moving to rural Vermont with a 6-month-old baby to work for a man she'd met once felt like either the bravest or most foolish thing she'd ever done. And Isabella couldn't decide which assessment was correct. Her mother's voice on the phone oscillated between concern and outright horror. You're going to live on a farm with a stranger. What if he's dangerous? What if the business fails? What if the litany of what ifs was endless? But Isabella had learned that sometimes the only way forward was to stop calculating all the ways things could go wrong and simply move. She researched Caleb online, found a modest web presence, a farm that sold raw milk to local customers, a man whose grandfather had been a pillar of the community, reviews from customers who praised both the milk's quality and the owner's integrity. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than the nothing she currently faced. The night before leaving Boston, Isabella stood in her empty apartment and said goodbye to the life she'd built and lost. The moving truck would carry her cheese-making equipment, Lorenzo's crib, and a few boxers of belongings, everything else sold or abandoned, because there was no point dragging failure into a fresh start. She thought about Marco, about the way he'd once watched her work with admiration in his eyes, about how that admiration had curdled into resentment when her passion for cheap wheat-making meant long hours and hands that smelled perpetually of culture and salt. He'd wanted a wife who made cheese as a charming hobby, not as a calling. He'd wanted someone who prioritized his comfort over her craft. The revelation of his shallow commitment had devastated her. But standing in the empty rooms, Isabella felt something shift, a recognition that his departure, however cruel, had freed her from the exhausting work of making herself smaller to fit his expectations. Lorenzo slept peacefully in his carrier, unaware that his mother was about to gamble their future on raw milk and a stranger's integrity, unaware that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with confidence, but with desperate hope and the stubborn refusal to surrender. The drive north through New England took on the quality of a pilgrimage, mile putting distance between Isabella and the wreckage of her marriage, each small town and forest bringing her closer to something unknown, and therefore potentially redemptive. Lorenzo remained remarkably content, as if he too understood that this journey mattered. Watching the passing landscape with the solemn attention babies sometimes display when witnessing something momentous, Isabella's old Honda, loaded with essentials, and trailing the small U-Haul trailer containing her cheese cave and equipment, climbed into the Green Mountains as afternoon light turned golden and forgiving. She'd spoken with Caleb twice more on the phone, conversations that covered practical matters, living arrangements, milk schedules, the cheese cave setup in the barn, but also revealed glimpses of the man himself, thoughtful pauses before answering questions, a tendency to understate rather than oversell, quiet concern about whether she'd find the isolation difficult after city life. The concern touched her more than enthusiasm would have. It suggested someone capable of considering another person's experience, a trait Marco had lacked entirely. The moment of choosing came not at the farm itself, but at a crossroads 20 miles from Maple Ridge, where a weathered sign pointed one direction toward the farm and another toward the interstate that would carry her back to Boston, back to the known quantity of failure and humiliation. Isabella pulled onto the shoulder and sat with the engine idling, Lorenzo sleeping peacefully in his car seat, while she confronted the last chance to retreat to safety. Going forward meant trusting a stranger, gambling on her skills in an unfamiliar place, raising her son in rural isolation where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away and the nearest community of fellow cheesemakers existed only online. Going back meant admitting defeat, moving in with her parents, finding a job that paid the bills but starved her soul, explaining to Lorenzo someday why his mother had abandoned her dreams, because fear proved stronger than hope. She thought about her grandfather, about the way he'd described leaving Tuscany for America with nothing but his cheese-making knowledge and a suitcase, about how he'd built a life through craft and stubbornness and the refusal to let circumstances dictate possibility. "Okay, little one," Isabella whispered, putting the car in gear and turning toward Maple Ridge. "We're doing this." The choice, once made, felt simultaneously reckless and right, the way all important decisions feel when we stop negotiating with fear and simply act. Maple Ridge Farm revealed itself as the road crested a final hill, a classic Vermont dairy operation spread across rolling pastures that glowed green in the late afternoon light. The farmhouse was larger than the photos had suggested, a gracious white colonial with black shutters and a wide porch that spoke of summer evenings and slow conversations. The barn wore its age proudly, red paint faded but still vibrant, its stone foundation and hand-hewn beams, testament to builders who'd thought in generations rather than quarters. Black and white cows, not the expected Holsteins, but smaller Jerseys, grazed in pastures, divided by stone walls that had stood for more than a century, their cream-colored bodies creating patterns against the grass like notes in some pastoral symphony. Isabella felt something in her chest loosen as she took it all in. A tightness she hadn't known she was carrying, releasing its grip as the beauty and solidity of the place registered. This wasn't desperation's last resort. This was somewhere a person could build something real. Somewhere the patient work of creating excellent cheese might actually matter, might actually be valued by people who understood that quality takes time. Caleb emerged from the barn as Isabella pulled into the gravel drive, wiping his hands on his jeans with the unself-conscious gesture of someone who spent his days working rather than posing. He looked different here than he had in Boston, more settled, more himself, as if the city had diminished him slightly, and returning to his land had restored his proper proportions. "You made it," he said, his smile genuine and uncomplicated, and Isabella felt the first small seed of trust take root. He helped her unload, carrying boxes with easy strength while keeping up a gentle commentary about the farm, pointing out the cheese cave space he'd prepared in the barn's lower level, mentioning that the cottage had been his grandmother's home and still contained some of her furniture, apologizing for the porch steps that needed fixing. Lorenzo woke and regarded Caleb with the suspicious intensity of babies encountering new people, but when Caleb simply nodded at him respectfully, "Welcome, little man," and made no attempt to coo or cajole, the baby seemed satisfied. Isabella noticed this, noticed the way Caleb respected her son's autonomy, even at 6 months old, and filed it away as evidence of character. The cottage sat 50 yards from the main house, connected by a worn path through grass that someone had mowed recently. It was smaller than Isabella had anticipated: living room, kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom, but clean and solid and filled with afternoon light that poured through windows facing the western pastures. Caleb's grandmother's furniture remained: a worn sofa covered in a faded floral print, a kitchen table scarred by decades of use, a rocking chair by the window that seemed to invite the kind of quiet contemplation Isabella had been too busy for in her previous life. "I cleaned it out," Caleb said, almost apologetically, "but if you need anything, furniture, supplies, whatever, just let me know. The farmhouse has plenty." Isabella walked through the rooms slowly, Lorenzo on her hip, taking inventory not of what was lacking but of what was present. Safety, light, space for her son to grow, a kitchen where she could prepare simple meals without the pressure of performing for someone who'd decided she wasn't enough. Through the bedroom window, she could see the barn, where her cheese cave waited, where she'd transformed Caleb's excellent milk into the products that would either save them both or prove that her confidence in her own skills had been hubris all along. First morning at Maple Ridge arrived with a quality of stillness Isabella had forgotten existed. No traffic sounds, no sirens, no city's relentless mechanical hum. Just birdsong and the distant lowing of cows and wind moving through the maples that gave the farm its name. She woke disoriented, reaching instinctively for Lorenzo, before remembering she'd moved his crib to the cottage bedroom's corner, before remembering that everything had changed. The morning light was different here, cleaner somehow, painting the walls with shadows of leaves instead of the harsh geometry of buildings and fire escapes. Caleb had left a note under her door: "No rush, milk truck comes at 8. Come to the barn whenever you're ready. Coffee's always on in the farmhouse." The casual kindness of it brought unexpected tears, not the bitter tears she'd shed over Marco's betrayal, but something softer, the kind of emotion that surfaces when we've been braced for cruelty and encountered gentleness instead. Isabella dressed quickly, bundled Lorenzo into his carrier, and walked through the dewy grass toward the barn, toward the milk cultures and molds that would either make or break her second chance, toward a life that smelled like pastoral Vermont instead of diesel and disappointment. The milk was extraordinary. Isabella knew it the moment Caleb handed her the first test sample, still warm from the morning milking, rich and sweet with the complex flavor that came from cows eating actual grass instead of industrial feed. She closed her eyes and let the taste fill her mouth, identifying notes of clover and wildflowers, detecting the subtle mineral quality that spoke to good pasture management and healthy animals. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing," she said. And Caleb's face lit with a pride he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. He showed her the milking parlor, spotlessly clean. equipment maintained with obvious care, cows that approached him without fear and seemed to regard the milking process as a pleasant routine rather than an ordeal. The Jerseys were beautiful, Isabella thought, smaller and more delicate looking than the hulking Holsteins she'd seen at industrial operations, their enormous brown eyes regarding her with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. Caleb introduced her to them by name: Clover, Daisy, Buttercup, Hazel, each with distinct personalities that he described with affectionate detail. "You talked to them," Isabella observed, and Caleb shrugged. "Their family. Of course I talked to them." Setting up the cheese cave became a meditation on possibility. The barn's lower level maintained naturally cool temperatures, and Caleb had installed proper humidity controls and aging racks following specifications Isabella had emailed him. She arranged her equipment with the care of a craftsperson, preparing for important work: the vats for heating milk, the molds for shaping curds, the thermometers and pH meters that would help her achieve consistency, the cultures and rennet that would transform liquid milk into solid gold. Lorenzo watched from his bouncer seat, babbling approval or confusion, his presence making the work feel less like desperation and more like building something for his future. Isabella had brought her best molds from Boston, the ones that created the distinctive basket weave pattern on her pec, the ones that allowed proper drainage for her aged Provolonian. Seeing them in this new space made her grandfather's voice echo in memory. "Good tools carry our stories with them, Isabella. They remember our successes and forgive our failures." She thought about the cheeses she'd make here, about the way Maple Ridge's excellent milk would elevate her traditional methods, about creating something worthy of the second chance this place represented. The first bath felt ceremonial. Isabella heating the milk slowly, adding cultures with measurements perfected over years of practice, watching the transformation begin as proteins bonded and separated, as liquid became something solid enough to hold, to shape, to age into excellence. Caleb watched from the doorway, trying to appear casual but clearly fascinated by the process, asking questions that revealed both genuine curiosity and impressive ignorance of cheesemaking's complexities. Why does temperature matter so much? How do you know when the curds are ready? What makes one cheese different from another if they start with the same milk? Isabella found herself explaining her craft with an enthusiasm she'd almost forgotten, describing how subtle variations in temperature or timing created entirely different outcomes, how patience was the cheesemaker's greatest virtue because rushing the process guaranteed failure. Lorenzo slept peacefully through her lecture, but Caleb listened with the focus of someone genuinely trying to understand, and Isabella felt something unexpected. Not attraction, she was too recently wounded for that, but recognition of someone who shared her respect for craft, who understood that good work required attention and time. The rhythm of farm life began to establish itself with surprising ease. Isabella woke with the sun, fed and settled Lorenzo, then worked in the cheese cave through the morning, while Caleb handled the milking and pasture rotation. Afternoons were for aging room maintenance, monitoring humidity and temperature, turning wheels, checking for mold, growth both desired and unwanted. The work was physically demanding in ways her Boston operation hadn't been, moving heavy wheels, cleaning equipment, managing multiple batches at different stages of aging. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way she'd forgotten work could be. She could see the results of her labor, could track each batch from milk to finished product, could hold in her hands the tangible proof of her skill. Caleb helped when he could, learning quickly despite his initial ignorance. His strong hands surprisingly gentle when handling delicate fresh cheese. They fell into an easy partnership, communicating in shorthand about schedules and needs, building the wordless efficiency of people whose work requires coordination. Evenings brought an unexpected gift: community. Caleb's neighbors proved to be a close-knit group of farmers and artisans who'd known each other for generations and welcomed Isabella with a casualness that felt like acceptance rather than judgment. Margaret Chen, who ran the farm next door, appeared on Isabella's third evening with a casserole and blunt questions. "You running from something or toward something?" Because Vermont's a good place for both, but it helps to know which. Isabella found herself being honest in a way she hadn't expected, not sharing all the humiliating details, but acknowledging that she was a single mother, rebuilding, that Maple Ridge represented a second chance she desperately needed. Margaret nodded, as if this was both expected and acceptable. "Caleb's good people," she said simply. "His grandfather was my father's best friend. That farm is his whole life. If you're helping him save it, you're doing good work." The comment shifted something in Isabella's understanding. She'd been so focused on what Caleb was offering her that she hadn't fully considered what she might be offering him. salvation for a legacy he was struggling to maintain alone. The moment of true commitment came not as a grand gesture but as a quiet recognition on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Isabella sat in the cottage's rocking chair, Lorenzo sleeping against her chest, watching the sun set over the western pastures and turn the mountains purple and gold. The day had been good, 2 batches of cheese progressing perfectly. Lorenzo happy and healthy, her body pleasantly tired from honest work rather than anxious from stress. Through the window, she could see Caleb checking the barn one last time before dark. His movements economical and purposeful, a man who'd inherited responsibility and carried it without complaint. Isabella realized, with sudden clarity, that she was no longer thinking about Maple Ridge as temporary, no longer calculating how long she'd need to stay before moving on to something better. This was the something better not because it was easy or glamorous or even particularly comfortable, but because it was real in a way. Her Boston life had stopped being long before Marco left. She belonged here. Not in the desperate way of someone clinging to the only available option, but in the deeper way of someone who'd found work that mattered, and a place that felt like the home she'd been seeking without knowing she was lost. The first completed wheels of Maple Ridge cheese emerged from the aging room after 6 weeks with a beauty that made Isabella's hands tremble slightly as she inspected them. The pecorino had developed a golden rind, its surface covered with a subtle bloom of beneficial mold that indicated proper aging conditions. She cut a small wedge to test, and the flavor stopped her breath, complex and nutty, with a sweetness from the Jersey milk that balanced the salt perfectly, a texture that was simultaneously firm and creamy, exactly what she'd been trying to achieve but somehow even better than anything she'd managed in Boston. Caleb tried it and closed his eyes, making a sound of surprise and pleasure that communicated more than words could. "This is good," he said finally, inadequately. And Isabella laughed, a first genuine laugh she'd produced since before Marco left. "It's better than good," she said, allowing herself pride. "It's extraordinary. Your milk makes all the difference." She watched him absorb this, watched him understand that what they were creating together was genuinely special, and felt the partnership deepen into something more solid than convenience. They debuted the cheese at the local farmers market in late August, a modest operation in the nearby town where sellers knew each other by first name and customers valued quality over quantity. Isabella set up her table with the same careful attention she'd used in Boston, but here, the context was different. She wasn't competing with dozens of other artisan vendors, wasn't trying to stand out in a crowded market, was simply offering something excellent to people who appreciated craft. The response exceeded her cautious expectations. Customers who'd been buying Caleb's raw milk for years tried the cheese with enthusiastic curiosity, then returned for more, bringing friends, asking when she'd have additional varieties available. By noon, she'd sold 3/4 of her inventory, including to a buyer from a specialty food store in Burlington who left his card and asked about wholesale pricing. Caleb watched from where he stood, talking with neighboring farmers, his expression revealing a pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with vindication, proof that his grandfather's legacy could survive in the modern world if adapted thoughtfully. Success brought its own challenges. The Burlington buyer wanted 50 wheels a month, the volume that would require Isabella to dramatically scale up production, to hire help, to potentially compromise the attention to detail that made her cheese special. She sat at the cottage's kitchen table with a calculator and spreadsheet, running numbers that revealed both opportunity and danger. Producing 50 wheels meant using almost all of Caleb's milk, meant long hours in the cheese cave when she should be caring for Lorenzo, meant transitioning from artisan to manufacturer in ways that made her uneasy. But it also meant income, real income, the kind that would let her pay down debt and build savings and stop waking at 3 a.m., calculating whether she could afford winter heating costs. Caleb found her there, Lorenzo playing with blocks on the floor, her face showing the strain of someone trying to solve an equation with no good answer. "What if we said no?" he suggested quietly, and Isabella looked up in surprise. "What if we kept it small and excellent instead of trying to become something we're not?" The conversation that followed revealed the philosophical gulf between building a business and building a life. Isabella, shaped by the competitive pressure of Boston's food scene and the desperate need to prove herself after Marco's abandonment, instinctively leaned toward expansion. More was better. Growth was survival. You grabbed opportunities when they appeared or risked losing everything. Caleb raised in a tradition that measured success in generations rather than quarters, argued for sustainability, producing what they could do well, maintaining quality over quantity, refusing to sacrifice craft for scale. "My grandfather could have sold this farm to developers 3 times, he said. Every time, he refused because this land matters more than money. Your cheese is special because you can give each wheel the attention it needs. If you're making 50 wheels a month, can you still do that?" The question hung between them, challenging Isabella's assumptions about success, forcing her to consider what she actually wanted beyond simple survival. Lorenzo, oblivious to the conversation, reached for Isabella's hand and smiled his gummy baby smile, reminding her that she was building a life for him, not just a business for herself. They reached a compromise that satisfied neither completely but worked for both. 30 wheels a month for the Burlington buyer, with a clause allowing them to reduce the order if quality suffered. Isabella would hire a part-time assistant, a young woman from town who'd apprenticed at a creamery and understood both the work and the standards. The arrangement would push them but not break them, would provide real income without forcing them into industrialization. The Burlington buyer accepted the terms with surprising grace, even seeming to respect the quality-first stance, and Isabella began to understand that perhaps the scarcity itself was part of the value. People wanted what they couldn't have unlimited access to, wanted cheese that represented real craft rather than efficient production. Margaret Chen, hearing about the deal, nodded approval. "You're learning Vermont logic. We don't grow corn just because we can. We grow what grows well here, and let that be enough." The wisdom felt both obvious and revolutionary to Isabella, trained as she'd been to believe that ambition meant always pushing for more. Autumn transformed the Green Mountains into something almost painful in its beauty, the maples turning gold and crimson, the light going golden and slanted, the air acquiring the crisp edge that promised snow. Isabella worked through the harvest season with a fullness that had nothing to do with busyness and everything to do with purpose. Lorenzo began to crawl, exploring the cottage with the determined focus of a small adventurer, and Isabella found herself able to be present for these milestones in a way that would have been impossible in her previous life. The cheese business stabilized into a rhythm that worked, not easy, but sustainable, producing income that allowed her to breathe without the constant panic of impending disaster. Her assistant, Sarah, proved to be both competent and pleasant, eager to learn and respectful of Isabella's methods. The cheese cave hummed with quiet productivity, wheels aging on their racks, each one representing not just income but craft, not just work but meaning. The threat arrived in November as an email from Marco's lawyer, cold and clinical and designed to cause maximum damage. He was suing for custody of Lorenzo, claiming that Isabella's unstable living situation and financially precarious choices made her unfit, that his new wife could provide a proper home for their son, that moving to rural Vermont with a stranger demonstrated poor judgment. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, each line designed to weaponize her courage and turn her fresh start into evidence of failure. She sat at the kitchen table, reading and rereading the document, while Lorenzo napped peacefully in his crib, unaware that his fatherhood never changed a single diaper, who'd never gotten up for a nighttime feeding, who'd abandoned them both without a backward glance, now wanted to take him away from the only parent who'd actually done the work of loving him. The injustice of it choked her, but worse was the fear. What if a judge agreed? What if her decision to rebuild her life in Vermont was interpreted as instability? What if Marco's traditional two-parent household with its suburban comfort looked better on paper than the reality of a single mother's determined struggle? Isabella's fragile new life in Vermont was shaken when her ex, Marco, sought custody of their infant son Lorenzo. Confiding in Caleb, her business partner and landlord, she admitted her fear and need for legal help. The community she'd quietly integrated into responded with quiet strength. Margaret found her a fair attorney, neighbors boosted her cheese sales, and Sarah offered to take on extra work. Their support affirmed that Isabella was more than an outsider, she was valued and worth defending. Attorney Joan Bella prepare for battle, reframing her as a devoted mother and successful artisan, rather than an unstable single parent. December became a blur of records, testimonials, and evidence to prove Lorenzo's well-being. Caleb formally testified to her dedication, but Isabella struggled under the weight of reducing motherhood into legal exhibits. Rosa, Marco's mother, then revealed his true motives. Marco's new wife, pregnant and eager for a complete family, had pressured him to pursue custody despite his lack of interest in Lorenzo. Rosa's willingness to testify shifted the case entirely. The custody hearing in January exposed both narratives. Marco's lawyer portrayed Isabella as unstable, but Joan countered with community testimonials and proof of her thriving cheese business. Caleb's calm testimony dismantled insinuations of impropriety. Rosa's devastating honesty revealed Marco's abandonment and selfish motives. The judge, visibly angered, ruled decisively for Isabella. Custody would remain with her, while Marco was granted only supervised visitation he'd likely never pursue. For the first time in months, Isabella could breathe, knowing Lorenzo's place with her was secure. With the case resolved, spring brought renewal. The cheese business flourished. Lorenzo took his first steps, and Isabella finally felt the stability her marriage had never given her: real, grounded, and authentic. Caleb remained a trusted partner, their bond deepening into quiet possibility. She turned down offers to scale her business, content with balance and the joy of watching her son grow. Maple Ridge was thriving not because of rapid expansion but because of patience, craft, and care. By summer, Isabella's cheese won awards and recognition, but her focus was on the life she'd built. Rosa became a regular presence, forming new bonds across generations. On a warm evening, Isabella reflected on her grandfather's lesson: like cheese, good things take time. Marco had chosen appearance and shortcuts, but she had chosen authenticity, devotion, and patience. Holding her son, she realized she finally had enough of what mattered: love, purpose, and the quiet contentment of a life honestly lived.